Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting this misty woodland scene. It's based on a photograph I saw a while ago of a managed wood with deciduous trees, bare and wintry on one side, and coniferous trees on the other side of the path, still with their evergreen foliage. It's a misty, low-lit scene, and I'm going to be painting a green sky. Now, I know that sounds a bit unusual, but I'm hoping that it's going to suit the scene and that it won't look too green. It will kind of just sort of look like a really neutral, gloomy sky, but one that's filled with that kind of misty, strange light that you get at twilight or dawn in these sorts of woods or forests. I'm going to mix this colour using perylene green, raw sienna, burnt sienna and indigo. I'm going to be painting wet in wet, and I'm looking for a graduated wash for my sky. So I'm keeping my brush strokes horizontal, charging my brush with plenty of paint across the pre-wetted page. I'm using a piece of Saunders Waterford 100% cotton cold pressed paper. It's got a lovely grain to it, and it's a sort of a medium texture. So it's a little bit rougher than smooth, but it's not quite as rough, if you see what I mean. It's taped to my board with ordinary decorator's masking tape. My board is at an angle of about 45 degrees so that gravity will help the washes to run and diffuse. And now that my graduated wash is in place, darker at the top than it is at the bottom, where I'm keeping my light glow, I'm going to paint in, while it's still wet, with burnt sienna, raw sienna and some burnt umber to very loosely suggest all the golden autumnal undergrowth that's growing on the forest floor around large tree trunks on either side of the path. And this is burnt sienna, raw sienna and some burnt umber, still using the same brush, but this time instead of using the belly of the brush and the whole brush to paint the sky, I'm using the corners of the brush and the tips just to change around and get this sort of suggested texture to give me the effects of the background that I'm looking for. Trying to keep the shape of the path, trying to keep the perspective looking right. I'm working quickly as well because all the time my wash is drying, and using the same brush, mixing up a sort of a neutral mixture of all my colours that I've already used, just dashing in the start of my path. So now this is perylene green, more or less straight from the tube, and I'm dancing this in for some of the coniferous foliage on this right side of the path. So I've got my deciduous trees in this managed woodland growing on the left, and here on this side is some sort of pine trees. So I'm just dancing in some of this foliage, mixing in a bit of burnt umber as I go to vary it up a bit, and this will soften and diffuse so that when I come back in and put in my tree trunks and a bit more foliage and branches, then I've got some lovely soft foliage in this background wash to work with as well. And I've decided just before it dries to use a synthetic round brush to put in some tree trunks. So it's the same sort of colour, perylene green with some burnt umber mixed into it, and a little bit thicker and richer and drier than the page is at the moment. That's important. And then just using the tip of the brush to get in some suggestions of distant trees. If I do this while the page is still damp, I'll just get them to, the edges will just sort of diffuse into the wash and soften. And then when I come back in onto the dry painting later, then I'll be able to build up more detail on top of the existing soft washes for these trunks, and hopefully it will give me a more sort of convincing look. Same on this side too. But of course this side there's no foliage because these are the deciduous trees that have lost their leaves. And now I'm going to take the corner of a plastic store card. You could use a palette knife or your fingernail, and pulling through the damp paint, I'm going to scratch the corner of the card through to the white of the page and give me the start of some nice branches, maybe some sticks and twigs in the foliage, just a few hints of that. Just dabbing back with a tissue if any of my distant trees are looking a little bit bold. I want them to disappear in the distance into the mist. And then coming back with the corner of the store card on the right and pulling through some branches again from the almost dry paint on these trunks. It won't work if it's dry. If it's too wet, it won't work as well. So you have to sort of pick your moment for this. And I'm just going to use the card again to run up the front leading edge of my trunks, just in case I want to preserve a bit of light. I can go back over that later on if I don't like the effect. The whole painting now is almost completely dry, so I can just get in a little bit of harder, sharper edged detail into the forest floor with these small autumnal shrubs on each side and sort of golden crispy leaves. And for this I'm using a Da Vinci small round synthetic brush, and no detail, just the suggestion of detail here, and then back with the corner of the card just to pull through that fresh paint that I've just added to integrate it and get it sort of looking bedded into the landscape. Now a nice dark colour to start off the shadows across the foreground of my path. I can soften back if it gets too dark in the misty distance where I want to keep it really light and blurry, and then I'm going to flick some water onto the page just to give me a bit of texture. And the last few touches for this first wash, I'm going to spatter a little bit of burnt sienna into the foreground. This will just sort of more or less disappear into the wash, but it will just give me that little extra warmth, and I may be left with a bit more texture. I used the fan brush for spattering, and now I've turned the brush round and I'm actually using the tips of the fan brush just to put in a few grass textures with that same burnt sienna mixture. And now just to bring back a bit of light into my path, using the corner of my store card to scratch back horizontal lines through the pathway, and then I can put a bit of darker shadow in and around that, and then I can finish off my shadows later on. But that means that I've got the base there for shadows and light across the path. Because it's quite misty, I don't need my shadows to be too strong, but I'm going to use them because I think they're a nice compositional device to link the deciduous trees on the left with the coniferous trees on the right. Then once I've put those shadows in, I'm going to leave the painting to dry completely. I forgot to mention that those last few bits of detail in the painting in the first wash were done with the painting flat. This is so that when I spattered on the painting that it wouldn't run down the page with gravity. But now I've got my page back up to my usual 45 degrees because it really does help, and it's an angle that I'm very comfortable painting at. I stand up to paint, but of course you don't have to. I find it just gives me a looser brush stroke, if you see what I mean, if I'm standing up rather than sort of sitting over a desk. But of course you paint however you feel or whatever's the most comfortable for you. So now that the painting's dry, I've mixed up a rich mixture with burnt sienna, perylene green and burnt umber, and I'm painting in my tree trunks. This is the main job for this second part of the painting, is getting the tree trunks in, and enough branches to be convincing, but not too many. This is where I'm going to be swapping around between painting in with quite rich dark paint and then using the corner of the plastic card to etch through the dark paint, and this easily gives me branches that look as if they're coming out from the trunk at all different angles rather than just all sticking out from each side. And then I can go between these areas and negatively paint slightly darker. The colours that I'm using have got a really high dryback rate, the perylene green and the burnt sienna. So even though it looks quite dark now, it will lighten back. I'll probably have to go in a couple of times with glazes over the dry paint to darken it up to get the shadows on these trees as dark as I want them. But if I painted the entire thing completely dark from top to bottom, I think it would look a little bit dull, a little bit boring. So I'm working carefully to negatively paint around those lighter areas. And that means leaving them unpainted. So those unpainted areas sort of give the impression of the branches coming out from the trunks. Trying to keep these trees a little bit paler as they go further back. The dark detail in the front brings those trees forward. If I keep less detail in the misty distance and the colours a lot paler and a lot weaker, then hopefully that will push the distant forest back so that we're creating this illusion of looking down the path into the misty distance. Now over to the other side, and I'm going to paint that in exactly the same way, but the only difference here will be that as I reach the area where I've got my foliage and where I'm going to add in a little bit more foliage, I'm going to make sure that I add some branches that make sure that the foliage is joined to these trunks. So again, working with the negative painting to paint around the lighter areas so that I look as if I've got some branches coming out from the front of the trees or in front of some of the trunks. And then putting in these branches to join to the canopies. So going in and beginning to darken up where the paint has dried back, still negatively painting, and making sure I keep this nice texture where there's this tonal variation on the tree trunks, gradually building it up to get these foreground trees looking as dark as I need them. And then some richer perylene green. This is a size 10 Escoda Ultimo synthetic mop brush, and just dancing in a little bit more foliage with the tip of the brush around those paler marks that I got in when the wash was still wet, which are very soft. So these marks would be a little bit harder, a bit more defined, sort of framing the painting around the top. I can, of course, soften back if anything goes on too hard or too dark. Just a few sort of loose dots and dashes here to suggest the smaller little bunches of pine needles. And now I'm going to be working on the next layer of the path, pulling across some slightly darker paint to increase the look of the shadows I can also use the card to scrape through there to make sure I'm keeping some light, and with the texture that I created in the first wash, I should hopefully get a sort of a convincing forest floor with that sort of something and nothing look with just suggested detail, so it doesn't distract from the main focus, which is the trees on either side and the light. The path is really just a device to sort of help guide the viewer's eye around the painting. So I think I'm nearly done. I think I just need to darken up the areas underneath the trees right near to the path, get some nice deep shadows in at the front. Making sure again to sort of negatively paint around areas that I want to look as if they're coming in front of the trees. And then just a bit more detail over on this left side with this nice bright mixture of burnt sienna with a little bit of raw sienna as well. And I think this helps to contrast where the light is stronger on the left side of the painting, particularly where the deciduous trees are growing because they have no leaves, so they're letting more light in. And that contrasts nicely with that darker, more shadowed area on the right side of the painting. So just darkening up a few of the branches, making some of these foreground ones really dark and really strong, and then making sure that, again, the trunks are dark enough. Just painting in these little shapes between the other branches. And I think you can see how it's starting to give the trees a really nice 3D effect by sort of using this layered approach. And then really darkening up the paint at the base. I think this layered approach keeps everything looking fresh and transparent. If I tried to go in really dark at the beginning of the painting, I don't think I would have got this sort of level of texture and transparency with different layers of paint showing through. So I'm going to remove the tape and have a look at it. I think it's finished as far as I want to take it. You could add more detail. Looking at it without its border, or if you've got a light mount or mat that you put over your paintings, you can see it with fresh eyes and see whether there's anything you need to work on just to get things balanced a little bit more. And I think if I look closely at this, I'm quite happy with the trees and the tree trunks, the foliage, all the loose undergrowth around the base of the trees. But I don't think I've quite got my shadows in. So I've retaped my painting to the board, and I'm just going to now paint in some stronger shadows from left to right across the path, just to give me that nice sense of harmony between the dark of the trees and the dark of the shadows across the path. That also, of course, draws more attention to the light between the shadows and to the light in the misty distance. So here's the finished painting, and I'm quite pleased with it. I think if I critique it, I would say I'd rather have my light in the distance a little bit higher, a little bit more light towards the top of the painting. And also I feel that the tree on the left is a little bit too far in from the side of the painting. Now I could crop that off when I frame it, but I think another tree just a bit closer to the edge of the painting would probably balance the the composition out a little bit more. So I hope that was helpful. Please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And thank you so much to my wonderful Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.